thank you all for coming, online and in person. This is fabulous to have you here, and I hope the online folks will consider themselves as much here as the people in the room. There will be, I think this is right, there are opportunities to ask questions if you're online. Is that a thing? We can do that? Yes? So when the time comes for conversation, you can participate online as much as here in person. And as long as I'm thinking about that, Adam was waving the microphone. For the folks in the room, when it's time for conversation, we will bring microphones around to you so that everybody can hear both in the room and in the great beyond. So I know you will be wanting to dive in and just start asking questions, but hang on and wait for the the microphone to come to you. Should I run through the ground rules now, or do you want to do that later?
Whatever you think is best. Sure. Yeah.
Well, if you're going to do it, that's.
I'm not. I don't.
You're not. Okay.
I don't have it here. Unfortunately.
I got it. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So then, before I introduce our speaker tonight, just a note about when it comes time for conversation. Please, let's do that. Absolutely, let's do that. And we have some ground rules for how we want to do that. This is not about but like last week, this is not about advocacy. This is about learning to think in a way that maybe we don't always use. So to help with that, as you have something to say, please approach the topic from the perspective of curiosity and not judgment. So not those people, but instead to learn about thinking in a different way, in this case. In what you say, seek to clarify and not to advocate. This isn't really about, as I say, advocating for a particular position as deeply as we will feel about the war and about Israel and about the Palestinians and all that. It's not time for that. Let's at least start with one opportunity to speak per person. It depends on how much traffic we have. I might be able to go for a second question if there's time. But let's start with making sure everybody who wants to ask something or say something gets a chance. Express your own thoughts and feelings as opposed to ascribing motivation to other people, right? All those people think X, Y, and Z. No, just talk about what you think. And don't respond to the questions or statements that other people are making, because that's not what this is for either. So, Dr. Don Compier is Dean of the Bishop Kemper School for Ministry in Topeka, which is a consortium of how many dioceses at this point? 6 dioceses at this point. A seminary of the Episcopal Church for particularly people in these nearby 6 dioceses. A fabulous program that we have benefited from tremendously, very, very directly at St. Andrews. And also professor of Christian ethics at BKSM. So he knows what he's talking about way better than somebody who had, an ethics class in seminary 20 years ago. So, Dr. Compier.
Thank you very much. I'm just so grateful that you all are willing to tackle difficult subjects like this. I just really admire. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I really admire that you want to deal with these difficult questions. And it's an honor, truly, to be invited. I'm really grateful for that, and it gave me a chance to do some really concentrated reflection, which was, I think, at least I learned something, and I hope you will in the process. I might say that we'll have questions and comments at the end. If I say something, or if there's something on the slide that you just don't understand, feel free to raise your hand and let's clarify so that we make sure everybody's that I'm explaining it sufficiently. And I'm glad to try again if I'm not. So I can't speak for Christian ethics in general, and I can't even really speak for our tremendous Anglican community across the world, which is in so many different cultures, has so many different traditions. So I thought I would just focus on our Episcopal Church and make this Episcopal reflections on what's going on right now in Israel and in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank and Lebanon as well. I guess things are intensifying this evening in Lebanon. So, the first thing I always want to tell people is there's no one way to do Anglican ethics or Episcopal ethics. We are a diverse bunch. And so we take a variety of approaches. And I have the four kind of main ones here, but I want to make sure that you understand that this is what we call an analysis for the sake of understanding. It's not a typology, okay? There are people in every one of these categories who are quite diverse from other people in that category, and there are people that don't really fit into any of these categories, or that will use several of them. Take, for instance, one of my favorites, Bishop Charles Gore in England in the late 19th, early 20th century. He would say he was an Anglo-Catholic, but he appealed to liberal principles and he was one of the main prophets of social justice in the Anglican Communion. So don't go around now and say, I wonder what Father John is. or oh, I can tell you're in this camp, right? We also use some words now that have changed in meaning, and so it can really throw you off. Look at right away at the word evangelical there. What do we think of when we hear that word nowadays, right? We think of fundamentalists, we think of the Christian right, or the religious right. That's not at all what we're talking about here. We're talking about people like the Wesleys and like John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace. One of the great living evangelicals today, self-declared, is N.T. Wright, the great biblical scholar, okay? So we're talking about people who love the Bible, and that doesn't mean they're literalists about it at all. They understand that the Bible has to be interpreted in a sophisticated way, but they love to focus on Scripture, and that's what we mean there by the word evangelical, which was what they used for themselves and still do in England. There's a very strong evangelical party in the Church of England. We used to have one in the United States. We had two seminaries even, a Virginia Theological Seminary and Trinity, that were very much associated with that, but Trinity has left the Episcopal Church, and Virginia has become very diverse. And so I'm a little bit worried, actually. I'm not an evangelical myself, but I'm kind of worried about they're kind of not doing so well. And I think there's something that gets out of balance. I worry if that's the case. Then we have people, of course, that emphasize tradition, what we call Anglo-Catholics. That name is not so conservative. Is not as controversial. I think it doesn't lead to bad associations the way some of the others do. And then we have people who will mostly want to reason. They want to use knowledge. They want to use science. They want to use critical study of texts and so forth. And we call that liberal, but it's not liberal like in the political sense today. Right? You understand that. We're not using it as a negative word, the L word. We're talking about people who like to reason and to reason together. And then the one that was added in the late 19th and early 20th century is insisting on social justice as the primary focus of ethics. And when they first became a party with Charles Gore and William Temple, they called themselves Christian socialists. Another term we should probably avoid today, right? Because it's become so tainted by our political discourse. So we tend to call them the prophetic movement in the church, or to liberation ethics. And let me just tell you, most of the people in the House of Bishops today are there. This has really gained strength in the Episcopal Church over the last 50 years or so. Now, my main point here is just to say, what is Episcopal ethics? Kind of depends who you talk to. There's different approaches that will be taken. And that gets, of course, even more diverse when we try to see the whole worldwide Anglican Communion. But I think there's still some things that everybody would tend to agree on. Here, I think, are the two core things. One is that we tend to avoid what we call deontological approaches. That's a fancy word. What does it mean? It comes from a Greek word meaning law. So deontological approaches are law-based or rule-based. It's commandments. You shall do this and you shall not do that, right? And there's a number of Christians, I hope you'd agree, that's their approach, right? They get it from the Bible, from their interpretation of Scripture, or they may get it from what they call natural law, which is, the belief that when we reason, we detect moral principles that God has placed in all human beings, and so we share this knowledge together as human beings, and that will lead to certain rules. Anglicans tend not to think that way in all of the camps I just described. We tend instead to do what we call character or virtue ethics. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that we're much more concerned about how people become moral agents. We want to form people, educate people, so that they will know as adults how to make decisions in complex ethical matters of right and wrong. So our concern is formation. And that means that really moral formation is part of our liturgical work. It's part of what we do in Sunday school. The whole development of the human person is what we're concerned about. And at being Christians, what we're really interested in here, as Lambeth said at their last meeting, they said every parish in the Anglican Communion ought to be concerned about producing Jesus-shaped people. So the character that we want to develop is the character of Christ. We want people to be Christ-like. And we believe that if they are developed in that way, they don't need to be told, thou shalt do this and thou shalt do that. That, in fact, that is kind of infantilizing and kind of authoritarian, and we don't like that. Let them make their own decisions as responsible agents who have been formed. So that's one thing we tend to have in common. The other thing is that we have a tremendous respect for the particularity of cases. That is, we know that there are general principles, and we hold to them. The sanctity of every human being, right? The wonder of creation, etc. We have general principles that we don't waffle on. Other traditions sometimes call us relativists. That is absolutely false. We are not relativists. We have core principles that we believe in and that we stick to. But we're aware of the fact that in the actual living of human life in history, things get messy, right? It's not that we don't know what the general principles are, it's how do they apply in this case, right? And that's, of course, especially true in matters of war and peace, because thou shalt not kill. Okay, that's a principle. But what does it mean here when you're being attacked by terrorists or, whatever, right? And so we like to look at the particulars, about the background, the circumstances, in which people actually make moral decisions. And that's why I watched the recording. Last week's presentation was so helpful because it allows us to see what's been going on there, how things developed to the way they are, right? We got a lot of background and a better understanding of the circumstances in which moral decisions now need to be made. And that was tremendously helpful. Are we clear so far? Let me know if anything is not, okay? Another way I like to put it is that, and this is kind of smug, I know, but but we like adult ethics, okay? We don't like to treat people like children, okay? And so there's a couple of ways in which that's true. One is that we tend to be pretty optimistic about the human person. We know that sin happens, right? We know that it's all over the place, it's a broken world, and yet we have been made in the image of God, and one of the things that means is that we have a conscience, right? We have a sort of innate ability to sense that some things are right and some things are wrong. And we have a capacity, even in the messy situations, to use reason, to work through things together, right? And so we don't want to tell people what to do in Episcopal ethics. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're accompanying people. We're giving them perspectives, information that they can then use in actual life situations to be moral agents in the world. Does that make sense? And the second thing that's adult about Anglican ethics, I think, is that we recognize that situations are so complex, and so we are suspicious of easy answers and polarizing right, wrong, black, white oppositions, right? We recognize that conscientious and responsible persons, good people, might reach very different conclusions on difficult issues. And we attempt to support all persons who are acting thoughtfully in good faith. And of course, the biggest example of that right away is war and peace. Okay? We have long supported the military. Most Episcopalians adopt what we call a just war ethic. That is, we believe certain wars are just, and as long as we fight them in a just way, for instance, not attacking civilians and so on, then we can be justified in defending ourselves and defending democracy and so forth. We have always fully supported our members serving in the armed forces. We have chaplains who are Episcopalian. I mean, our former Bishop Field was a Navy chaplain, for instance, right? And we have a bishop for the armed forces. Just a new one was just appointed. by the House of Bishops to lead and to coordinate all the efforts on behalf of the military. So if you are an Episcopalian and you decide that you need to fight to defend your country, we will back you, absolutely. But since the 1960s, we also realized that there were very conscientious people who felt they could not, as Christians, participate in war, what we call conscientious objectors. And we have developed ways to support them too. And if they come to us and say, hey, I need an endorsement from my pastor, from my bishop, so that I can actually show to the draft board that I'm a conscientious objector, we will do that for them. We will support them. So you see, is this wishy-washy? Some people say it is, right? Or is it rather saying, we know that things are complex, and different people will, for good reasons, come to different conclusions. And whenever people are acting in good faith, trying to do the right thing, we want to be there to support them. And so we have groups, right, that support our military personnel. Adam was just telling me about a new group here, right, that's forming for veterans. That's wonderful. My father was under Nazi rule for 5 years and was liberated by 21-year-old men and women from Canada, England, and the Americas. And the one thing he taught me is you always respect vets, okay? And that's not okay not to, right? They have suffered. They have been traumatized. They've gone through much to be where they are. But we also have groups that are in favor, that are peace groups, right? That advocate for nonviolent resolutions of problems and support those who are doing those kinds of things. And we'll see one of those later called the Episcopal Peace Network. So, do you think we're wishy-washy? Or are we instead trying to realize, we may not know everything down to every jot and tittle. And so let's try to support people in the messiness of figuring these things out in a broken world. I hope this is clear so far. This is kind of the general approach of how Anglicans or Episcopalians here in the United States would approach issues. And we need to talk especially about when we decide to speak out on social issues. For a long time, this was not very common. We were the establishment church in England, and in Virginia and so forth. Often we were the church of the educated, the well-off, and so forth. The joke used to be we were the Republican Party at prayer. I don't think that's true anymore, but the Republican Party's changed, of course, a little bit. And so what we tended to do, and what many still prefer to do, is let's focus on individual morality, okay? Let's talk about using drugs and alcohol. Let's talk about avoiding, abuse of children and individual things where it's about individual persons. And it's not an either or, right? We should attend to issues of individual morality. We should not neglect those. But beginning in the end of the 19th century and on into the 20th, Episcopalians were influenced by developments in England, which culminated in the Archbishopric of William Temple in World War II. And Temple had, from the time he was his father was the Archbishop of Canterbury, okay, so he was born to the purple. But from the time he was young, he stood up for women clerical workers in the church. He stood up for striking miners. He stood up for working people who didn't have education. And when he became Archbishop of Canterbury during World War II, he developed a whole program for post-World War II Europe called Christianity and Social Order, which was a bestseller, Penguin paperback. I happen to have a first edition, And so he was tremendously influential on the whole Anglican communion with his saying, we also have a responsibility for social justice, right? We also have a responsibility to lift our prophetic voice. And at the same time in the United States, we had what we called the social gospel movement, which was a very ecumenical approach to deal with the problems of the inner city, first in New York and then throughout the country, Detroit and so on. And so those two strands came together to make Episcopalians much more socially conscious and willing to stand up and speak out on controversial issues. But we don't want to just mouth off, right? We don't want to just have everybody say, well, I think. Richard Hooker denounced that back in 1600, what he called the me thinketh tendency, right? The baptismal covenant is the key to everything, right? And several times a year, we recommit ourselves to this, right? What is, to me, always a very meaningful thing. And the two key promises that we are dealing with when we talk about social issues are, first of all, we will, with God's help, seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving our neighbor as ourselves, right? And the second one, we will, with God's help, strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. No exceptions there, right? And so we've all pledged ourselves to that as part of our baptismal covenant. And our job is to discern how these core principles apply to specific social questions of our time, like the war between Israel and Hamas right now. And we've developed a procedure to do that seeks, on the one hand, to avoid individualism, which is, of course, a rampant problem in our culture. Everybody wants, well, I think, and watch some talk shows. They used to have a thing called, was it firing line, where people just yell at each other and stuff like that. We don't want that. And on the other hand, we believe that if we can come to a shared statement, that will have more influence and more power than just an individual speaking here and there, right? And so we've developed a procedure. We have a very democratic polity. People forget this, We are much more democratic than other parts of the Anglican Communion. We rely on that democratic polity and on our common prayer, that we should pray about issues together, right? To discern what our position should be on social questions. Now here's just a partial list of things that we have come to official positions on. Racism and ending racism, gun violence, voter suppression, immigration, the rights of refugees, the environment, abortion, the rights of GLBTQ persons, and international issues concerning war, peace, and just development for all people in all lands. That's, like I said, only a partial issue. There's a whole lot more social positions that we've developed as the official positions of the church. And we don't have to agree with those, as we'll see, but we need to, it's helpful if we know what they are. And it's helpful if we know how they're developed, because it's not just, somebody gets an idea and boom, there it is. It goes through a rigorous process. First, we trust our bishops. We elect our bishops in this country, right? And we can recall them if it needs be under certain circumstances. They serve us, but we expect them to be teachers. We expect them to be spokesperson for the church. And of course, the main one is our presiding bishop, who has been elected to be the spokesperson, the head, the main guy that the news agencies go to when they want to figure out what the Episcopal Church is up to. And of course, we have a very eloquent person right now in Michael Curry, right? So we need to, we are an Episcopal Church. We respect the office of bishop as teachers and spokespersons. But second, we have this bicameral general convention, right? We have people here who are deputies to the next one coming up. Oh, yeah, okay. In 2024, we're going to have it again in Louisville. I was blessed to represent Kansas. At that point I'm now canonically resident here. Okay, I'm part of West Missouri. But at that point, I represented Kansas at the 2018 convention in Austin, and it was just a tremendous learning experience for me. Okay. We have two houses, House of Bishops, which is kind of like our Senate, and we have the House of Deputies, which has equal representation of lay persons and ordained persons. And they legislate for the church. They're like our Congress, right, on social questions and internal matters as well. Proposals are studied by legislative committees. I served on one of those last time, and believe me, that's a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff that comes to it, and you call witnesses, and you have hearings, and so that it's thoroughly vetted before, and those legislative committees then have to make a recommendation to the floor. And they have representatives from both houses on those committees. And then remember that for something to be passed and become official, both houses have to approve it. If just the House of Deputies does, no go. Just the House of Bishops, in most instances, no go, right? It has to, so I hope you can see this is a really careful process. It takes time for us to develop a position. And we go through a process of discussion, deliberation, and prayer together to see what our consensus should be. And in between general conventions, we have an elected executive council. And they then kind of fill in between conventions, and when needs be, will speak out on key issues in accordance with previous expressions of the church's sense, okay? So that's our messy democratic process in the Episcopal Church, which nonetheless has led to a lot of important statements of where we stand on issues. Now, I think something I really learned, which I love, because I've been in a previous denomination where this was not the case, is that we don't just pass things and say, well, now you know what our position is. We try to walk the talk, as they say, right? And we do that a couple of ways. First of all, we publicize it. We had, of course, using social media and all that. Secondly, we employ lobbyists. There are people in Washington who represent the Episcopal Church to Congress and to the White House. They don't have a lot of money to take people on junkets and fancy vacations, okay? They have to rely on persuasion. But they meet all the time with legislators and try to tell them why the Episcopal Church feels strongly about this issue and how we feel about it. And then secondly, we have this thing called the Episcopal Public Policy Network. Anybody can sign up for it. And the Episcopal Policy, once you have signed up, you'll get regular notices saying, hey, there's this issue coming up in Congress. In accordance with the position our church has taken, we would want you to write a letter to them. And now, in fact, as we'll see later, they've actually done it for you. So all you have to do is push a button, and you fill in your name, and boom, your letter goes off. It takes like 3 seconds. You know, this new technology, man. I was in Amnesty International for a lot of years. I had to write all those letters by hand, you know. Now, boom, there you go. And, of course, whenever possible, we work with our ecumenical and interfaith partners. We're part of the National Council of Churches in Christ, the World Council of Churches, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's what's important, okay? It's not mandatory that you agree with the position the church has taken. Again, we're adults here, right? We respect the freedom and dignity of people. No one's going to say, well, you know, the church has this position on abortion, and you're advocating for something else, so you're not a good Episcopalian. We will not do that. Much less will we ever consider asking somebody to leave the church because they don't agree with us. That's not how we work, right? As somebody who's trying to be adult about things. So persons have to decide for themselves. Can I support this position that our democratic process has produced, or can I not? And we respect everyone who makes that decision in good conscience, right? But we do believe that as individuals consider, well, should I support this or not, it's helpful to be aware of what positions the denomination has taken and the rationale given for discerning things as they did. And I've been kind of surprised, frankly, that very often many of us don't have any idea what the church has decided on issues. And I think we need to do a better job of getting the word out. Not so that people say, hey, you have to agree with this, but people know, you know, the church has taken this stance on abortion, it's taken this stance on gun control, etc., as something to think about as you make your own moral decisions on those issues. Does that make sense?
As long as it's accompanied by the rationale.
Yeah, we have to know why. And so you can go back and read the debate and so forth, and usually if you look at the original resolution, the whereases will tell you what the rationale is. And all of that is available now online. So, to get to our matter tonight, what has our church said about the conflict between Israel and Palestine that's been raging, as we learned last week, since 1948, if not before, right? And I didn't really know this. I knew that things that happened at the 2018 convention because I was there, but I didn't realize that they had a body of legislation going back well into the 70s that articulated a very consistent position. And we've been quite consistent with the original insights that we developed in the 70s. And subsequent events have modified, you know, how you have to apply the principles, but the main principles have stayed very steady for 50 years now in the Episcopal Church. And we could go into a lot of different legislations, but I thought it might be more helpful if I just tried to summarize for you in a couple of key points what the official position of the Episcopal Church has become on the issues in Israel and Palestine. Number one, we affirm the rightful existence of a Jewish homeland in light of the horrors of the Holocaust. We understand that Jews cannot trust other governments to defend them. Okay? And by the way, across the world, anti-Semitism is on the rise again. We're seeing more and more anti-Jewish hatred raising its ugly head again. And so we have insisted that Israel's right to exist must be acknowledged. When Hamas became a power in Gaza in the late 20-aughts, we actually passed legislation calling upon them to stop their position that Israel has no right to exist, to stop terrorism, to stop this extremist position of polarization, and to move to a negotiating position that would assure the rights of all. So we specifically applied that to Hamas. So we have history with Hamas, going back to about 07 or 08. We respect all persons. You know, our baptismal covenant requires that, right? There's no exception of persons, as Peter says in Acts 10, right? I now realize, basically what he's saying is, I realize that now that God has no favorite nation status, right? Everybody is beloved by God. And yet we have to acknowledge that we have a special relationship with the Jewish people. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we share more than 3/4 of the scriptures with them, right? More than 3/4, because I don't think you can understand much of the New Testament if you don't understand Judaism. Not right anyway. There's all kinds of interpretations, but you won't understand it rightly if you don't see how Judaism is all over the New Testament as well as the Old, right? And so obviously we're in constant dialogue about the meaning of those scriptures with the Jewish people. Islam comes along later. They're also in the Abrahamic family, but we don't share scriptures with them in the same way, right? But there's another way in which we have a special relationship with the Jewish people, and we learned that last week, and that's that for almost 2 millennia, we were the primary cause of Jewish suffering, death, expulsion, discrimination, anti-Jewish prejudice, etc. And, you know, the best minds in the church articulated that anti-Judaism. One of my pet peeves is the way that we sometimes will venerate a saint and not mention that this particular saint hated Jews and said horrible things about them. For instance, John Chrysostom, the great preacher and social justice advocate from Constantinople in the 400s, right? Wonderful preacher, but he preached 2 different series on why Christians must, and I quote, hate Jews. Because, quote, the Jews are demons, unquote. Okay? And you can take that throughout Christian history, okay? Martin Luther, his wonderful tract on the damnable Jews and their lies. That's the name of the tract, okay? And we have to remember that this evening, November 9, in 1938, was Kristallnacht, right? The night of the broken glass, when they began the severe persecution of Jewish people by attacking synagogues, burning sacred texts, desecrating graves, some 20,000 Jewish shops that were destroyed, about 100 people killed, many more wounded, 20,000 Jews arrested, 10,000 sent to Buchenwald, the first time that Jews were sent to camps to die. Okay, and let's be clear: Hitler was not a Christian. Okay, he was a pagan. He admired Wagner's operas and all that stuff, right? But he'd read all those anti-Semitic things that Christians had said, and he quoted them. He was aware of Luther's work. He was aware of Chrysostom and Ambrose and many others. Okay, and he would say things like, "Well, I've got the guts to do what you guys said, but didn't have the guts to carry out. I'm going to give you a final solution of the Jewish problem," right? And sadly, not all by any means, but in many countries, including the United States, many Christians were in favor of what he was doing and said so. So once we realized the horror of what had happened at Auschwitz and Sobibor and Treblinka and so on, it was a moment of existential crisis for Christian theologians and thinkers, right, and pastors. And you can see this particularly at the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s, right, where in the Good Friday liturgy before that, they had a curse on the Jewish people. It was part of, as part of remembering the death of Jesus, you said, "And may the Jews be accursed." It was part of the liturgy. And so we went through a massive repentance of the vast majority of Christians saying, we can't do that anymore. That's wrong. We've got to stop that. And a whole different and more productive relationship has been developing with the Jewish people as a result of that. But we can't just pretend that history didn't happen. And that when people were attacked on October 7 by the Hamas terrorists, and all the brutal and horrible things happened, and so many people died, that was the worst day of Jewish killing since the Holocaust. So we have to kind of understand the shock, the horror, the fear, right? That is going to cause to well up, right? And that special relationship is that we ought to be the ones who understand and who we may disagree on the particulars of policy, but we can't ever go back to saying Jews don't have a right to defend themselves. Jews don't have a right to their own homeland, right? We are not anti-Zionists. We may have difficulties with some of the ways that Zionism is living out, but we're not against the basic idea that there should be a Jewish homeland. Secondly, we have advocated from the beginning for what is called the two-state solution, and this was talked about last week. That is, many experts and advocates around the world, including many people in Israel, believe that the only way to a lasting peace is to have two homelands side by side, one for Jews and one for Palestinians, and that each of them would be free, autonomous states, but have a peace treaty so that they would live side by side in peace. We tend to forget that the Netanyahu government is a minority government. And if you do polling in Israel, most people still believe in the two-state solution. Haaretz, the leading newspaper in Israel, has just pounded on this since October 7. Said we've got to return to that kind of process. Otherwise, we're going to continually get these kinds of things. So this was the accord, as we learned last week, that was almost reached in 1990, right? Arafat walked away. Rabin was assassinated, and hardliners on both sides began to take over, Hamas on the one hand and the settler party on the other. You know what we mean by settlers, right? These are the people that illegally go into what is Palestinian territory and drive Palestinian people away, sometimes with great violence, and then establish their own homestead or housing on occupied territories. It's illegal. It's against international law. But increasingly in recent years, the party in power in Israel has looked the other way and done nothing about it. And we say that that's no way to peace, right? We have to find that we have consistently endorsed the two-state solution. Third, we denounce all terrorist violence from any and all sources. We have no use for the horrible things that Hamas did on October 7, or what was done at Munich, or blowing yourself up on a bus, etc. We are totally and unalterably opposed to that. But at the same time, we have also consistently advocated for the full human rights of the Palestinian people. We deplore illegal Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory. We deplore the violence that's been perpetrated by Israeli settlers, the erection of border walls and special roads and other impediments to the ordinary life and commerce of Palestinians. Anything that makes them second-class citizens, anything that makes their life difficult and dangerous, we're opposed to, and we have consistently had that position. We have consistently opposed naming Jerusalem as only Israel's capital. We're okay if we get to a two-state solution and both sides want to claim Jerusalem as their capital. We understand that it's a special place for Christians. By the way, there's a minority of Palestinians, right, that are Christians of various kinds, including Episcopalians, Anglicans, right? So we know that Jerusalem is a holy place to all those people. We're okay if they want to share the capital, but to make it exclusively the capital of the Jewish state of Israel is something we have opposed from day one. Okay? We have demanded scrutiny of all U.S. aid whether military or otherwise, given to Israel, because we don't want any of that money to lend support to the illegal settlements in the occupied territories or leading to the relocation or dislocation, disenfranchisement of Palestinian persons. Okay. In short, we support the equality and well-being of Palestinians within Israel and in the occupied territories. We believe the only way to peace is for both sides to recognize that the other side has equal rights, human rights. We have invested in businesses that seek to provide gainful employment for persons in the West Bank and Gaza. I didn't know that. About $700,000 went into one enterprise out of Episcopal Church funds to provide jobs for Palestinians. We have also supported social services, and of course, one of those was the Al-Hi hospital in Gaza, Al-Hi. And that was a really rough day for many of us when we saw that hospital hit. Apparently, most of the evidence is now suggesting that it was an errant rocket from the Palestinian side. But however it happened, it's just, it was not just a hospital. It was a place where people were taking refuge as their homes were destroyed or they didn't feel safe in their homes anymore. And it was just, that was one of the worst days I've had in recent weeks, just to see that beautiful effort that we have had there to be hit like that. Fourth, we have consistently sought to be honest brokers and peacemakers. Okay, so we don't want to demonize one side or the other. We don't want to say, oh, we're totally pro-Palestinian or oh, we're totally pro-Israel. We want to be honest brokers, and if to do that, we have to show a certain independence, right? We've encouraged Episcopalians to visit the Holy Land, to make connections with persons and organizations in both Israel and the occupied territories. You've been recently, right? Have anybody else been to the Holy Land? Oh, wonderful. Yeah. When did you go? 1988. Wow. Things were a little different then, but yeah, but still, there's nothing like meeting people, right? There's nothing like seeing the reality on the ground. And I really appreciate how you've preached about that and shared some of your experience, because there's nothing that can replace that, right? And so it's dangerous right now, but as much as possible, we should try to personally familiarize ourselves, personally make contacts. I have friends in Israel, but I don't know people in Palestine, in Gaza. And I need to, right? I need to find a way to do that. We've also encouraged interfaith conversations in the United States. And I think one of the most beautiful things that happened after October 7th is immediately here in Kansas City, Muslims, Jews, Christians getting together to pray, right? I think you were part of some of those efforts as well. We needed, the more that we're together, the more we're talking to each other, the more we can come to common purpose and understanding. We've constantly supported and consulted with the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, right? And we've been very careful not to take positions that make it difficult for them. And the House of Bishops are particularly monitors there. And we also speak to other Christians there, the Orthodox, the Lutheran presence, interfaith partners, and so forth. There's been several attempts to introduce language at the General Convention. I saw some of this in 2018, that polarizes and inflames by using terms such as apartheid and Zionism as racism. Both of those actually were used in United Nations resolutions from the General Assembly. But they were very offensive to Jewish people and very hurtful. They didn't bring peace. They further polarized things. We've encouraged scrutiny of investments, as I already said, but we've rejected attempts to completely disinvest from companies that do business with Israel. During when Catherine Jefferts Schori was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, at its equivalent of General Convention, made the decision to completely disinvest from Israel. And people really pressured presiding Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori and the House of Bishops and the General Convention. Well, we should follow suit. We should do that as well. And one of her most eloquent statements, Catherine Jefferts Schori said, no, we're not going to do that, because if we do that, we're no longer honest brokers. We will have no longer any credibility. We want to be seen as someone who can be a peacemaker. And we can't do that when we take these really harsh stances that seem to favor one side over the other. However much justice there may be in some of the particulars, we want to maintain relationships with both sides, because that's the only way that we can talk our way to peace, hopefully, right? Fifth, every time that violence between Israel and the Palestinians has broken out, every time we've called for ceasefires. And we've called for a return to negotiation in accordance with the two-state solution. Pope Francis, as soon as the conflict broke out, said, this needs to stop because in war nobody wins. You know, everybody loses. And that's kind of been our position, you know, that the way forward there, nothing's going to be solved by violence. Not in this case. And so we need to stop the hostilities as soon as possible and return to the negotiation table. And of course, as was suggested last week, right now that's falling on a lot of deaf ears on both sides. But that doesn't mean we felt we need to say it nonetheless, right? To keep insisting on it. So finally, how has the church responded to Hamas's attack on October 7th and the subsequent military actions by Israel? And the short answer is, in a manner completely consistent with our previous positions. We have a clearly marked out position, so we don't have to figure this out new, because as was said last week, it's a repetition of a pattern we've seen again and again and again, right? And of course, the General Convention won't happen until next summer, so we can't have legislation on this matter until then. So the Executive Council has had to make statements, which they have, and the House of Bishops and our presiding bishop in particular have made statements. And again, those are in the nature of ceasefire, please. Let's have negotiations. Just this week, I believe it was on Tuesday, I'm getting ahead of my own story here, sorry. From the beginning, we said we harshly denounce what Hamas did on October 7th, okay? You don't kill kids and kidnap kids. You don't behead people. You don't rape women, you know. Those kinds of acts have no justification. Whatever the grievances may be, that's not the way you respond. But we've also insisted from the beginning that Israel has to respect the rights of the ordinary citizens of Gaza, most of whom don't support Hamas, right? So we've deplored all killing of civilians as a violation of just war and international standards. We've called for immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to negotiations. But just this week we had a heartfelt cry from our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, who, you know, his whole theme is love, 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 right? If it's not about, I mean, he's the most popular guy to do that since the Beatles, right? I mean, you know, and he does it with great theological profundity, right? That if it's not about love, it's not about God, right? And so forth. And so I hope you'll read the whole statement. It's available. Have some of you read it already? Yeah, it's available on Episcopal News Service and other. You can easily Google it on the computer. And I recommend that you read the whole statement. I'm just trying to give you a feel for it here. It's one of the most passionate statements I've ever seen him make. Would you agree with that? Yeah. He says he's raising his voice for love because more than 10,000 people have died in Gaza, including more than 4,000 children. My call to love is simple, he says. Stop the killing. Stop all of it. Stop it today. For every human child of God, Palestinian and Israeli, deserves safety and security. He insists that staying quiet in this moment would be a stain upon our souls and would deepen our complicity. Think about that. That's quite a statement. And then, in kind of the final words, vengeance will not bring back the dead. Retaliation will not repair the harms and the hurt. We must stop the next 10,000 from being killed. We must call upon our leaders, President Biden, members of Congress, and others, to be unequivocal that we need to stop the killing. Today, this is clearly what love demands of us. This is one of those times where he's not wishy-washy at all, right? He feels that he needs to say it plain, right? This is how he sees it. And in response to that, if you go to the website of Episcopal Public Policy Network, they have a button that you can click on if you want to share with your congressional people and with President Biden. And they produce a letter for you. The letter says, we deplore what Hamas did. We're not in any way supporting that, but what's happening in Gaza has to stop. There's too much loss of innocent life. We call upon a ceasefire now. And President Biden has already kind of suggested that that's what he would like to see. And other leaders around the world have joined him in that. And if you feel that that's something that you can support, generating the letter and sending it to your representatives takes less than a minute. This is slick, this is technology way beyond my understanding. Okay. Let us reiterate. No one is required to agree or to take the proposed action, right? It is up to each of us to make that decision. I've simply offered it for our careful consideration in the reasonable spirit of our episcopal ethics. I think one of the things I want to say in conclusion, though, is that one of the feelings I had immediately when this all broke loose, my Israeli friend, close colleague for many years, has a son and a son-in-law that are in Gaza fighting right now. They were in the reserves and they're called up, And I wish I knew people in Gaza too. But since this whole thing came up, I think washed over me a sense of helplessness, right? What can we do? Well, I'm here to say to you tonight, there is something we can do. And there are at least two things if you feel so inclined. One of them is to go to the website of the Episcopal Policy Network and sign that letter, if that's what you're comfortable with. Something that we should all be comfortable with, I think, is sending a check or an electronic contribution to the American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, okay, who run that wonderful hospital there in Gaza and many other things like that, okay? They need our support more than ever. And there's nothing that talks support like money, unfortunately, right? But it's true. We need to, we can show them that we are with them at this difficult time. So I don't want anyone to go away here saying, it's just, it's so complex, it's so over our heads and everything. There's just nothing I can do. There are things we can do. The question is, what do we feel comfortable with? What accords with our own conscience on these matters? Right. Well, for further study, you can look at the website of the Episcopal Public Policy Network, which has a lot of information about past actions of the church. So does the Episcopal Peace Network. I should have said, I'm sorry, I left a word off there. It's the Episcopal Peace Network. Their website has a lot on the previous legislation of the Episcopal Church. And you can look at the governmental relations page on the website of the Episcopal Church. In terms of Episcopal ethics, I think the best living Episcopal ethicist is Timothy Sedgwick, recently retired from Virginia Theological Seminary. And any book by him would really educate you as to how Episcopal ethics works. One of his books was a textbook, right, at VKSM. And alas, a book that's out of print, which is still very valuable.
Also has short articles
Yes.
that are much easier.
Yes. And he's a good example that he doesn't really fit in any of those camps. He's a kind of an Anglo-Catholic because he loves liturgy, but he's liberal and he wants to use all reasoning, right? And he's in favor of social justice as well, right? So he's a great example of that. But there's this other book by Paul Emmon called The Anglican Moral Choice, which I just loved, but it's 1983 and it's out of print. If you can find a cheap copy on Amazon, grab it. It's still a wonderful read. Yeah.
I just looked it up on Amazon. You can buy it new for $245.
Look to your church library, or come to BKSM and we have a copy in our library there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate, and I'm glad to hear your questions, responses, etc. Yeah.
Well, there's one name I didn't hear, and that was F.D. Morris.
Well, he's part of that.
Well,
he's one of the
he's
major
a precursor to Bishop Gore and
Sure, right.
to
Right.
William Temple.
Yeah.
And his feast day is this week.
Yes.
You
But
know.
he also abhorred conflict, and whenever there was conflict, would withdraw.
The other feast day
So-
that was recently is Hugh of Lincoln.
Yes.
And Hugh of Lincoln was back, I think, in the 12th century, and he was actually against the removal of Jews. at the time.
Yes.
He stood firm on that. It was unusual, but he
Yeah.
did, and it slowed up the
Yeah.
emigration of Jews from England at
Although
the time.
eventually they were expelled.
They were expelled
Yeah,
eventually,
that-
but not because of
Yeah.
Hughes.
Not because of him. No, there were always countervailing voices that stood up for what was right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a rich history, and there's F.D. Morris. There's lots of figures actually in that tradition, from Morris to Temple, and here in the United States as well. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I found them really useful. I recall a quick exchange that I had with Father John about 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about this very session, and I was asking him about it, and he said, it's a difficult issue when you have one side of the conflict, actively pushing away, and I was struck by that, and I've been thinking about that, and I was brought back to that thought in your comments. The position of the church, I think, is clear. And I wonder how you operationalize that position in the context of the behavior of the other side, right? So in this case, I'm going to speak specifically about the Hamas tactics of, positioning themselves within the community, within the hospitals, within the refugee camps,
Human shields, right?
using these poor people in the way that they do, and then coming forward and I wonder. I was just thinking, how does Israel respond to that when their leadership, as recently as a day or two ago, right, reiterates the perspective and the position that their only mission and their only objective is the elimination of the state of Israel. And so I'm left puzzled by how to maneuver that. How do I wade through that? There does seem to be a need perhaps to respond to what Hamas did. Does it seem as an overreach? I can clearly see how it's perceived that way. When we're talking about thousands of children, it can't help but, touch your heart. And at the same time, I'm struck by what's the response? The idea of turning the other cheek, right? And I go, gosh, in today's world, how does that really work? And so I'm curious, do you have any thinking on that when one side is taking a position that is so opposite of what we're proposing here or what's been defined here by the church? How do you operationalize that?
It's challenging. I think we should understand that when there's a call for ceasefire, we're not just saying to the Israelis, lay down your arms, we're saying to both sides. So it's an appeal to both Israel and Hamas. Whether either side will listen or not, we don't know. But I think our concern is about all those stuck in the middle, right? There's this minority Hamas that I think they either have to change or die. Okay, this is going to go nowhere but bad, right? But you also have the Jewish settler mentality that's either going to change or die. There's no future for that. So what we're concerned about, I think, is all those people in the middle, all the innocent. What happens to them? How can we have a conflict? And maybe in a place as crowded as Gaza, it's mighty difficult, right? But how can we, as much as possible, protect the innocent who did not attack Israel, who are not attacking, the people in settlement violence and so forth? The vast majority of both Palestinians and Israel who want nothing other than to live in peace and be left alone, right? And I think what we're trying to do is make sure that their voice isn't lost or drowned. But it's extraordinarily difficult, right? And I don't think we should kid ourselves about that. This is a messy situation, right? And I think it's important to say we are never going to make excuses for the kind of actions that Hamas did. Our only word for that is that it's utterly wrong, right? And no matter who does it, right? But is anybody listening, right? I think that the pressure is building, frankly. I think I'm seeing more and more U.S. government officials, United Nations officials, European Union officials, who are pretty much saying what Bishop Curry's saying. You know, it's okay. We just need to at least have a reset here for a minute, okay? So more people can get out of Gaza or something like that, because, you know, and frankly, I think there are a lot of people who fear how this affects the image of Israel. And there are people who are very pro-Israeli who just worry that this is going to, you know, is a PR disaster for them. See what I mean? Yeah. But thank you for, it's a very, yeah, it's not simple at all, is it? Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned the people in the middle, the people who are not, I mean, we don't really hear about them. And basically, you know, what we hear is that the Palestinians voted for Hamas in their election.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile the fact that there are these people?
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to even believe that those people exist.
Yeah. Well, they voted for Hamas around 07, 08. Hamas then violently eliminated any and all opposition. And so recent polls show that they're extremely unpopular, but they're a dictatorial regime. So if there was a vote, a free and fair vote today, they'd be gone. But of course, they're not going to allow that. And what we always have to remember, and this doesn't get talked about nearly enough, I think, the power behind that is Iran. Okay? Hezbollah and Hamas planned all this with Iran. So, you know, who's the major enemy here, if you want to put it in those terms, right?
Interesting.
And Iran doesn't care a whit about those people in the middle, right?
So,
Yeah.
a question. Curry's statement about vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
How are we to see where self-defense morphs into vengeance? Where's that line, and how do we, as an ethicist, determine
Great
that?
question. Yeah. Yeah, we believe in justice, right? We believe in accountability. So we're not saying, well, you can just do things like that and never mind, all right? But, yeah. Yeah.
I see a news story and think, is that vengeance, or is that legitimate self-defense?
Yeah.
And should I send that letter?
Yeah.
And what will that letter, will it be perceived as, I don't want Israel to defend themselves, or will it be perceived like, oh,
Right.
they're going too far? And
Yeah.
I mean, this is,
Yeah, it's tough.
and that'll change. By the time I send that letter tonight, there might be another missile that hits, an their ambulance or something.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very tough. But you know, I think one of the things that we have to be aware of, and Biden tried to tell them this, but of course it's so hard to listen. He said, "Look, remember us after 9/11? You know, you get into a rage mode, and you're not thinking clearly, and then it becomes very hard to know what is defense, what is justice, and what is vengeance, right?" Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that we're trying to say is we need a little pause here, okay? I'm not saying you have to agree with that position at all. I'm just trying to explain, I think, what the presiding bishop is saying, because right now there's a lot of people that their mind is not really operational. You know what I mean? They're just so angry, and they want to hit somebody, right? And I felt like that sometimes, you know. I know what that's like. Yeah.
It seems like one of the problems, too, and going back to what Steve was saying, I think this is right. Just war theory evolved in a time when those who would have been conducting war would have been state actors,
Right.
or royal actors, or whatever.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have been
Yes.
terrorist groups. They wouldn't have been.
Yeah.
They didn't have the ability to make
Yeah.
war in the way we see now. So if you have one side of a conflict housing its operations in neighborhoods and with schools and putting the tunnels under population, it's hard to know, how do you respond to that in a just way. I mean, it takes
Very
it kind of takes the rules off the table, doesn't it? So what does one do for just conduct of war when there's no state actor?
Yeah. Yeah.
I want an answer. No.
No, I mean, Pope Francis has said, he says, I think in the current conditions of warfare, just war theory just doesn't work anymore. He's denounced it. He says, it was once a great idea, but it no longer works.
So what's next?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, is there a?
Right.
I'm ignorant. Are there frameworks of ethics evolving for those situations?
Yeah. Well, I think at least what we're trying to, what the presiding bishop and the Pope and many others are trying to do is say, as much as possible, be careful with kids, If you can, as much as possible, try to avoid hitting them. They've not done anything, right? And so it may be an ideal that's not going to be reached, but as much as possible, let's try to approximate it.
Do you think then that's the intent of not going beyond the eye for an eye? That's where we know where the line is between defense and retaliation.
Right.
Only an eye for an eye, but not an eye for,
Right.
and then take both eyes.
But that we have to. This is in a way an interfaith matter, right? Because we of course we cite Jesus, right? You've heard it say an eye for an eye and tooth, but I say to you, But the Jewish state has made it very clear that they believe in an eye for an eye. You hit us, we'll hit you. Okay, and so so there's a kind of veiled critique of that, and I think what Bishop Curry and others are saying, that as Gandhi said in their view, an eye for an eye only leaves the whole world blind, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
The thing about this, if we go back to the issue of the principles of our ethics, for me, living in this culture, which is so black and white, I can see why we are seen as wishy-washy. It's not hard. I think the challenge for us in our arena is to understand our Anglican moral tradition clearly enough that we can speak it and we can share it and we can talk about it. And it seems to me more of these sessions would be really useful just to have a deeper understanding. We can be leaven, it seems to me, in our culture, and together we can work to come up with opportunities, strategies, etc., to communicate that. So,
Yeah. Thank you.
The just war theory comes from Augustine, and it was a tribal justification. So, Israel could take a tribal approach to, but it's all about proportionality. You have 1,400 killed, and then you have 10,000 killed. Is that proportional? Doesn't seem like it. You've got one group using bombing, that's efficient for urban warfare, but it's a terrible way to carry on a war against, terrorists.
Right. I think we also have to look at statements that have been made by people. When Hamas says that their goal is the destruction of Israel to drive the Israeli people in the sea, well then, that's pretty clear. But people in the coalition of Netanyahu have said that they want to do the same thing to Palestinians. So that raises a question. What are you really doing here? Are you defending yourself? Are you, eye for an eye? Or are you actually seeing this as an opportunity to further your goal, which is to wipe Palestinians out of this area altogether? Because they said publicly that that's what they want to do. People in the coalition of Netanyahu. Right, right.
Netanyahu has worked against the two-state
Yeah.
solution for
He's never accepted it.
16 years.
He's never accepted a two-state solution. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So if there is negotiations before either side loses, one side needs to lose the will to fight. before negotiations will work. And in the killing of children, I do believe that one of these days there'll be war crimes, war crime trials for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what people are worried about is, when does that exhaustion happen, right? When, as we learned last time, the Palestinian population is rising 6 times as as fast as the Israeli population, and yet the Israeli population continues to get arms and so forth. Is it going to be like 2 people left standing that then want to negotiate? You see, so there's lots and lots of mayhem that can happen. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's part of the rationale for let's have at least a temporary ceasefire and reset, because, it's not clear that either side can actually win this.
So, Dean Dunn, I think one of the things that I grow concerned about as I watch the news and the ramping anxieties that are popping up here in America, and we're seeing this happening in every major American city, rallies for one side, rallies for the other. How do we apply these Anglican ethics to try to help calm? Because this could become very really and close to home very soon.
Yes.
I mean, the Country Club Plaza has a rally every day right now.
Right. I think that and I'm talking here about friends of mine, okay? It's one thing to say, I don't support the policy of Netanyahu and this current military strategy. It's another thing to say Zionism is inherently racist. The Jews have no right to have a homeland. Lots of other people don't. The Kurds don't, etc. You see, and some of the vitriol that's coming, like calling the woman that played Wonder Woman a war criminal because she served in the Israeli army. Okay, so one of the things I hope we can do is to say, can we calm the rhetoric a little bit here? Okay, this is really not helping. And I think our position has been very consistent there for a long time, that we try to avoid, overheated polemics that really make you feel good about the righteousness and virtue of your side, but otherwise don't accomplish very much, right? Yeah. Another thing we can do is pray, by the way, every day.
Any advice for social media? I mean, I have friends who are Palestinians. I have family and friends who are Jewish and have people in Israel, and they're both putting lots of stuff on social media, and it's I empathize with both, and I feel kind of sinful for just staying silent, but I don't quite know. I just don't know.
It's hard for people to hear right now, isn't it? I mean, after several exchanges, I realized that this is not a time for me to disagree with my friend in Israel. He's not listening, okay? So I've tried to say things like, that I'm committed to the right of Israel to exist, right? I want peace for you, and that I'm praying for your son and your son-in-law, okay? But that's really all he can hear right now, and so that somehow they can know that we support them as people. We're praying for them, and when things get calmer, maybe we can have a discussion and an exchange of viewpoints. But right now, that's pretty hard, right? Yeah.
I mean, what you've described here to me is the underlying principle. It's the ethic of love. You love these people, and you keep loving these people.
That's what God does, right?
Or as my mother said, you may hate the deed, but you love the sinner.
Right.
So,
yeah.
And it seems like, at least for us, if we can have some sense of inner clarity about sometimes being silent is the loving thing to do.
Listening, yeah.
That's love. And speaking the words of encouragement to your friend, that's the loving thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think if we could keep thinking about what can I do that just shows love and not get into this battle of right and wrong.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I have problems with righteousness because it's so
It becomes self-righteousness. so quick.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, whereas love is not righteous.
Yeah.
It's full of grace.
Yeah, and you know, I hear people say a lot, well, is there any hope, you know? And the clear answer to that is yes, and it's not because of us, it's because of the way God is, right? God is not going to quit. God wants peace there. God wants the rights of all to be respected, and God's not going to stop that. And God's going to keep inviting us to be part of that process as best we can. And that's where the hope lies, right? And remember that Arafat was just as bad as Hamas, okay? He was behind the Munich thing. He was behind suicide bombers. And he was persuaded to say that way will not work. It's unfortunate that he ultimately walked away, but he lost all authority in doing that, creating, unfortunately, a vacuum, right? But he was, you know, he and Begin, you know, kind of shook hands. You could tell in their faces that it was very difficult, right? Remember that picture? Yeah. So, you know, even Hamas, though I don't have much faith in their moral conversion, may be forced by circumstances to say, you know, this ain't working, and we need to find another way. So we can never give up hope on anybody in that sense, right? Yeah.
One of the words I hear in terms from other faith groups and friends is evil, and nothing in the ethics stuff. I don't know. Is that a concept that's
we talk about
unhelpful?
Well, no. We talk about
so how do we think
But-
about evil in the terms of just generally in
Yeah.
ethics, but also in this context?
I think we have to be very careful. I mean, you know, cutting off, you know, coming into someone's home, cutting their head off, dragging their kid into captivity. You know, I think we'd all agree that's evil, right? I mean, but we tend sometimes to use the word too quickly of our opponents, right? Where that judgment and righteousness thing enters in, right? So it's not a concept that doesn't exist. I mean, the Holocaust was pure and utter evil, right? But we want to be humble and careful to not apply that label too quickly, because it for sure shuts down dialogue. If I say, well, you're evil, well, that's not going to lead to the negotiation table. Right? Yeah. It can be, but I mean, right. But I think that, like I said, this is again where, I mean, I've been told to my face by other Christian friends that my church is wishy-washy. Okay, so it's not just that I think they're suspecting it; they've said it outright. Okay, but we have some core principles here, right? And there are some acts which are inherently evil. They're demonic. They're against God's purposes. They're against the worth of all God's children, and you know we can't budge on that. But we have to be very careful about how that term then gets used for any and all opponents. You know, the Raiders are evil. You know, whatever. You know, they are, but you know.
Could you end this with prayer?
Sure. Do we have any other questions or comments before we do that? Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
That's a question.
I just think, too, that psychologically, when we get to that point, we kind of let our, I'll use the term id, dominate. It just consumes us instantly. And at that point, we're most likely to do the most outrageous thing, even if our cause is just. And so I think we have to be real clear about that just among ourselves, even in this group, because it's so easy to get, I mean, I can think about it and I can get really wound up about Hamas's tunnels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can get just as equally wound up about the bombings And at any moment, I can go here or I can go here
Yeah.
if I let myself be possessed by that. And hanging in the center, the via media, the way of love, is the most difficult position.
Yeah. And let me say something a little risky here, but something I feel strongly about. Watching Fox all day, watching MSNBC all day, listening to talk radio all day is not good for the soul. It does not lead to good ethical judgment. Some of those people are deliberately stirring up like adrenaline because that's how they get ratings. That's how they get you addicted to their program. Okay, and that's not just on the right or the left. It's all over the place. Okay, so I really keep my news to a minimum. Okay, I know where I can sort of get an objective report of what's the latest things happening, and that's all I do. Because otherwise you just get consumed by it, and that's not helpful to me or anybody else. My opinion. My experience. Yeah.
Who needs a mic? Sounds like.
Well, I really appreciate your really thoughtful and honest questions. You know, and this matters. This kind of thing matters. Okay, we need to do things like this. We need to find ways to sit down with the local Jewish community and the local Muslim community and have honest discussions like this. You know, I think once people realize you really do support them, you really want what's best for them, when they know that, then you can begin the harder conversations, right? But it makes a difference. It really does. What you've done tonight and what you've done in setting up these 2 weeks is significant. I really want to thank you for it. And it's been a privilege to be a part of that. Yeah. Yes, the Lord be with you. God, we thank you that we have a wonderful tradition. It's human, it's got its foibles, its weaknesses, and yet over time you have guided us into a particular way of being a branch of the Jesus movement. And we thank you that these are guideposts in difficult times like this to help us to think through the issues together. We thank you for our Jewish and our Palestinian sisters and brothers and of various faiths. And we just commit ourselves to being a people of peace, of believing in solutions guided by love, by care for all your creatures. May we not give up hope. May we know that there are things we can do that make a difference. And may we never lose sight of the fact that as far as you're concerned, this will come to a peaceful resolution, and everybody in the Holy Land will walk in peace. And may we pray and look and work for that day in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.